is a mysterious ought pressing down our lives, and God explains the universal nature of the moral claim. As God is outside of the world, God the Creator can be both external and make universal commands. So let's get into the alternative options. What about biology? Can biology or evolution or natural selection form an ontological grounding, the rational foundations to really peg our moral values, what we think is absolutely right or absolutely wrong? Can biology become that foundation to ensure we can say that killing Zachariah is morally wrong, objectively, regardless if the whole world came together and said it was right? Well, let's see. And let me start with an interesting example that Charles Darwin actually called an extreme example in his book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. He says, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Because if we were just a reaction to social biological conditioning, then if we were reared like the hive bees, then we could be doing these things that we now consider immoral. Take, for instance, if we were to be reared just like the nurse shark. The nurse shark actually wrestles with its mate, which is tantamount to rape. So if we were reared according to the same conditions as the nurse shark, then we wouldn't be saying rape is morally wrong. This was Charles Darwin's view, in terms of giving an extreme example to say, well, if we were just a reaction to social biological conditioning, then there is a particular issue. It doesn't ground it objectively, because it's relative to biological changes. It is no wonder Michael Rules, the philosopher of science, is an atheist also, in his Evolutionary Theory and Christian Ethics in the Darwinian paradigm. He says, morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is illusory. This is his views, and he is an atheist. Now, Professor Dan Dennett, who wrote the book Consciousness Explained, I believe in 1991, he tried to argue that we don't really have what I would call the subjective inner experience. He argues it's an illusion because he's like a type A materialist, which basically means that there is no what it is to be like. For example, Hamza, he has a strawberry, and there is a particular subjective phenomenal experience, which is like the experience that is only unique to myself. What it is like for Hamza to eat a strawberry. He almost denies that and says it's just neurochemical patterns in the brain. You don't have this inner experience. And he writes somewhere else that basically the idea of rights, human rights, from a Darwinian perspective, I believe he quotes someone else, he says, is nonsense upon stilts. We've just elevated our sense of human rights, they're objectively good. You know, these liberal, neoliberal human rights, the UN Charter on Human Rights, these are objectively good. The whole world must come and agree to them. Unfortunately, even sometimes at the barrel of a gun. But yet, even from a philosophical perspective, it's nonsense on stilts. Because where's your ontological foundation? Where's your rational grounding to ensure that these are objective? Because if you're trying to look for an objective basis, you're going to be looking at God, not at biology. Now, some may argue, okay, fine, evolution may not give you the answers. What about natural selection, though, which is particular to evolution? Now, they may say, well, natural selection can provide us with that kind of rational foundation. Well, this is not true either, because all that natural selection can do is provide us with the capacity to formulate ethical rules. It doesn't give us the foundation for objective moral truths, or the foundation to see and acknowledge and assert that this is objectively evil. This is why the moral philosopher Philip Kitcher, he writes, all that natural selection may have done for us is to equip us with the capacity for various social arrangements and the capacity to formulate ethical rules. And this is cited from the moral argument by Mark D. Linville in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. So biology is not an explanation for our sense, that inner kind of assertion that some things are objectively right and some things are objectively wrong. Someone may argue, like many humanists argue, especially humanists from the British Humanist Association. I had a discussion with Andrew Compson, who I believe heads the group in the University of Birmingham, and he asserts that the way we get our morals objectively is through coming together as human beings. Fair enough. That equates to social pressure. But if social pressure becomes a kind of foundation for objective morals, we have a few issues. The first issue is, and yes, I know some people think this is the minute you cite Nazi Germany is the minute you lose an argument. No, that's not actually true. I want you to understand the example. There was a form of social pressure that killing Jews was okay in Nazi Germany. Yes, there were people who disagreed with this. Yes, there were activists who were fighting against this. We know that. But there was a consensus that it was morally okay. If we accept that as a basis for our moral values to make them objective, then we're in trouble. How can we objectively say that killing 6 million Jews is objectively morally wrong, is objectively evil? As a theist, I can say that. As a non-theist, using social pressure as an argument for the basis of my moral outlook, that would be very problematic. How can you say such a thing? How can you say, for example, back in history, according to Hindu culture, if the husband were to die first, his wife would have to throw herself into the fire where he's being cremated? How can we say that's objectively morally wrong if we cite social pressure? We cite this coming togetherness to agree on particular morals and values. And if we understand, for example, society properly and we study social psychology or social constructionism, we see that society is not this static thing, it changes. For example, if you read the book Social Constructionism published by Routledge, by Vivian Burr, she argues that there are certain constructs in society. Like, for example, take beauty as an example. I know this is not everybody, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think you get the example. We have this L'Oreal because I'm worth it culture. And we have this reductionist view on beauty. Like you may see sometimes in the magazines, I love my husband because he has great cheekbones. And what about the rest of him? Right? So we have this reductionist view in beauty because unfortunately, via capitalism and avid materialism and neoliberalism, I would argue, combined all of these things together in a cocktail, they create dispositions that actually view beauty in that way. But it's very hard sometimes, especially in a popular culture sense, to understand beauty in a holistic way. The inner beauty, plus the outer beauty, plus the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that happens because of the social construct. And Vivian Burr argues the people who have the power to shape the discourse, like the capitalists, those who have money and power, the politicians, the media, they shape our understanding of words, which therefore shapes our disposition, which therefore shapes the entire society. Take the word love, for example. Many of you may define love not like Rumi, because Rumi said, the famous poet, when the pen writes of love, it breaks in two. But we would define love as maybe an internal emotion. That's why you have some crazy guys who beat up their wives or girlfriends. They'll say to the police, but I love her really. Because it's become an internal emotion. But if you look at a few hundred years back, especially in Greek culture, my grandmother would say to me, Ela edo na se agabiso ligaki, which means come here, let me love you for a bit. It was a behavior. Obviously there are grades. But what I'm trying to show you is even our understanding of words shapes our disposition. And those words and the meaning behind them are actually constructed by powers in our society. This is social constructionism, people. We're enslaved to it, frankly. Take, for example, the way we look at morals. Generally speaking, in a liberal society in England, homosexuality is fine. By the way, I'm not passing any judgments before anyone wants to report me, yeah? Because you get so much rubbish on the web. I just have to put these caveats all the time, yeah? I'm using it as a friendly, warm, compassionate example. Is that fine? So, just take homosexuality as an example. 50 years ago, or even, not even 50 years ago, it was seen as a disorder. I'm not passing a judgment, yeah? But now it's seen as something that's okay, right? Why is that the case? Because society changes based upon power struggles, different ethical viewpoints, different ideologies that are being adopted, and that's life, that's society. And society shifts humanity to a certain perspective, or it takes them backwards, depending on what your position is. So the point is, social pressure can never be a basis for our moral outlook, to establish and assert that killing innocent 6-year-old is objectively evil or wrong. So is there an alternative? I mentioned moral realism. And some atheist philosophers, because I would argue they had this sense of ought, as Professor Ian Markham says, this sense of ought within us, that we know some things are right and wrong. Some atheists say, well, you know what? Morals and our sense of evil is not grounded in anything, but they're just objective. This is called moral realism, which translates in the following way. Morals are objective. Evil is objective because it just is. They just are. Frankly, that's not an argument. I can say Islam is the truth because it just is. Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, upon whom be peace, was the final prophet because he just was. That's not an argument. That's, in my humble view, trying to have your philosophical cake and eat it. But also, with moral realism, how does that give you a sense of obligation? From just asserting their objective, how does that now translate into an obligation for me to be merciful or for me to be just? It doesn't translate. If there was a divine command, therefore you have an obligation. But in absence of the divine command, and you're just asserting the morally objective, then how does it make sense of now moral duty? Moral realism doesn't make sense of moral duty. So I would argue the best foundation, if we do